years. 3 years of watching and saying nothing, of filing reports that somehow always disappeared before they reached the right desks, of standing in hallways where the air itself felt like it was listening. But Charlotte was 11 years old when it started. She's 14 now, and a child who has spent 3 years being quietly dismantled deserves someone to finally say what happened. My name doesn't matter. My rank doesn't matter. What matters is that I was there. I was posted to the East Wing corridor every Tuesday and Thursday, which means I was there the afternoon Charlotte came back from her equestrian lesson with mud still on her boots and joy still on her face. That particular kind of joy that children wear when they haven't yet learned to check whether it's appropriate. And the kind that takes up space, the kind that makes noise. She was humming. I remember that specifically. Some pop song she'd half-mangled into her own version, words replaced where she'd forgotten them with sounds that were almost words. She was swinging her riding helmet by the strap. She almost knocked over a vase that costs more than my annual salary. She didn't notice. That was Charlotte. Unbothered in the way only children with real safety can be unbothered. Children who have never had reason to watch their peripheral vision, who have never learned to read a room before entering it. She hadn't learned yet. She was about to. The East Wing drawing room has 3 entrances. The main door, which faces the corridor, a side passage, used primarily by staff, and a set of interior doors that connect to the private sitting room, the one reserved for family use, the one whose threshold most of the household staff had quietly agreed never to linger near. Charlotte took the main door, burst through it really, still humming, dropping her helmet onto the nearest chair with the careless confidence of someone who has never had to be careful. Camilla was already in the room. She was seated near the window with 2 women I didn't recognize, not staff, not family, not anyone with clearance I'd been briefed on. They were the kind of women who wear their expensiveness quietly, in the cut of things rather than the shine. One of them had a small leather notebook. The other had her phone screened down on the side table, which is the specific gesture of someone who knows recording devices are unwelcome. But Charlotte stopped humming. The room did what rooms do when a child enters a space they weren't meant to enter. It contracted. The conversation that had been happening, whatever it was, didn't pause. It simply ceased to have ever happened. 3 faces turned toward Charlotte with the specific expression of people rearranging what they'd been caught holding. "Oh," Charlotte said. Just that, already recalibrating, already shrinking, though she hadn't moved an inch. "I didn't know you had guests." "No," Camilla said. "You didn't." 2 words. The temperature of a walk-in freezer. Charlotte stood there a moment with the particular stillness of a child who is doing rapid emotional arithmetic, adding up what she'd walked into, subtracting what she could pretend she hadn't noticed, carrying the remainder. She was 11. She was good at it, but not good enough to know she shouldn't have to be. "I'll just get my—" she started, gesturing toward the bookshelf where she kept a few things. "Later, darling." Camilla's smile had the structural integrity of paper. "We're in the middle of something." Charlotte left. I watched her walk back into the corridor. Not the burst she'd arrived with, but something careful and quiet that looked nothing like her. She pulled the door closed behind her with both hands, making sure it didn't make a sound. She stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. Then she straightened up, and the look that crossed her face was not sadness. It was the look of a person filing something away for later. The women left 20 minutes after Charlotte did. I had a clear sight line to the main entrance, and I watched one of them, the one with the notebook, pause in the entryway and say something to the other in a low voice. The other woman laughed. Not a warm laugh, the kind of laugh that's really an agreement. I noted it. I wrote it down in my personal log that evening, the way I'd been doing for 4 months by then, because 4 months earlier something had started to pattern in a way I couldn't name, but also couldn't dismiss. It had started with the scheduling. Charlotte's calendar began to shift in the spring of that year. Gradually at first, an overlap here, a commitment moved there. A riding lesson that suddenly fell at the same time as a family dinner. A school event that somehow wasn't passed to the relevant coordinator in time. Small things. Things that, individually, looked like administrative errors. Except they weren't random. They were always Charlotte's engagements that moved. Never William's, never George's. Always the 11-year-old girl who was at the precise age where being repeatedly told she'd gotten the schedule wrong, been in the wrong place, arrived at the wrong time. That kind of sustained low-grade confusion does specific work on a person's sense of their own reliability. I know because I watched it work. By June, she was double-checking herself out loud. Is this the right room? I thought it was Tuesday. Did someone say the time changed? She had stopped trusting her own memory. That's not an accident. That's architecture. The second thing I noticed was the photographs. There is a particular sitting room, I won't specify the wing, where family photographs are arranged on a long-side table. It's not a formal display, and not curated for public tours. It's the private kind, accumulated over years. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesdays, the kind of surface that tells you who a family actually is. Charlotte was in a lot of those photographs. Then, over about 6 months, she was in fewer of them. Not all at once, never obviously. But a frame moved here, and the one that replaced it didn't include her. A photo that had been at the front of the arrangement migrated to the back. The new additions, there were 3 new additions over that period, featured the larger group, the formal arrangements, the ones where Charlotte appeared smaller, peripheral, easily overlooked if you weren't looking. I was looking. I understand that photographs move. I understand arrangements shift. I understand I could be wrong about what I was seeing. But I had been standing in corridors for 12 years at that point. I had learned to read the grammar of spaces, what moves and why, what accumulates, and what gets quietly subtracted. And what I was reading, in that room, over those 6 months, was a sentence being slowly rewritten. The thing about Charlotte, the thing that made what was happening to her both harder and eventually her salvation, is that she noticed everything. She just didn't show it in the way adults expected her to. She didn't cry, didn't act out, didn't become sullen or difficult in the visible, manageable ways that might have prompted someone to ask what was wrong. What she did instead was get very, very observant. Her eyes went a particular way when she was cataloging something. A slight quality of stillness that looked, if you didn't know better, like the comfortable vagueness of a distracted child. It wasn't vagueness. She was reading the room, every room, all the time. I noticed this first in November, a week after the incident with Camilla's guests. I was posted outside the family dining room when Charlotte arrived 3 minutes early, unusual, she was reliably 4 minutes late, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before going in. Not hesitating, surveying, taking in who was already seated, where they were looking, what the quality of the silence was. Then she walked in like it was just dinner. She was 11 years old, and she had already started doing what I had been professionally trained to do, read an environment before committing to it. I felt something cold move through me, and something else. Something I wasn't supposed to feel, wasn't paid to feel. I had no professional framework for. Something that was, if I'm honest, a lot like grief. End of part 1. By January, I had 47 entries in my personal log. I kept it in a small green notebook, the kind sold in stacks of 3 at any high street newsagent, because anything that looked like a professional document felt like a liability. I wrote in it during my off hours on the 11:20 train home in the particular yellow light of a carriage that's mostly empty. I wrote down dates and times and what I'd observed, the flat way you record data, without adjectives, without interpretation. The adjectives lived in my head. I didn't trust them on paper yet. The 47th entry was from a Wednesday in mid-January, and it read, "See removed from upcoming photography session. Reason given, scheduling conflict." No corresponding conflict on confirmed calendar. That was the entry where I stopped telling myself I might be wrong. The photography session was for an official family portrait. Not a tabloid shot, not a candid, a commissioned portrait, the kind that ends up in formal correspondence and hung in specific rooms. George and William were both confirmed attendees, so were the adults. Charlotte had been confirmed too, originally. Her name had been on the briefing sheet I'd seen in late November. By January, the briefing sheet had been reissued. Charlotte's name was gone. The reason in the amended document read, Princess Charlotte unavailable, prior educational commitment. I pulled her academic calendar. I'd never been briefed on it in detail, but I had enough access to verify the broad strokes. No educational commitment existed on that date. On the day of the portrait session, I was not posted anywhere near it. But I know a member of the household staff who was, and she told me, not suspecting, I think, that it mattered, that Charlotte had appeared at the entrance to the room where the session was being set up, presumably having walked there under the assumption that she was expected. She was turned away. The reason given to her, at the door, by an adult who should have known better, was that there had been a misunderstanding about the schedule. Her misunderstanding. Her error. Charlotte had apologized. My source said this lightly as a detail, the kind of detail adults don't think twice about. The dear, she apologized, always so polite. She said it warmly. She didn't see it. A child who had done nothing wrong, like apologizing at a door for being somewhere she had been confirmed to attend, and walking back down the corridor having absorbed the blame for something that was not her fault. I need to stop here and say something clearly. None of what I observed constitutes a crime. None of it would survive a formal complaint, and I tried, twice, to escalate through internal channels, and twice my concerns were received with the particular courtesy that means they will go nowhere. What I observed is the kind of harm that doesn't show up on a medical chart or a legal document. It shows up 30 years later, in a therapist's office, in the way a grown woman second-guesses her perceptions. It shows up in the body. I know this because I grew up in a house where the same architecture was used on a smaller budget, with less sophistication, I with cruder tools. The exclusions that look administrative. The corrections that always land on the same person. The slow, patient work of convincing someone that they are consistently, reliably, constitutionally wrong. About the schedule, about what they heard, about what they saw. I know exactly what it is. It doesn't need a name to be real. Charlotte's turning point came in March. I didn't witness it directly. I was told about it afterward by two separate sources who gave accounts consistent enough that I trust the composite. I've reconstructed it the best I can. There was a meeting. Not a formal meeting, but the kind that presents itself as informal. A small gathering in one of the private sitting rooms. Adults. A conversational register that sounds like a check-in. Charlotte was asked to attend. She attended. What happened in that room I'll get to. What I want to tell you first is what happened before it. Because the before matters more than people realize. Earlier that morning, Charlotte had apparently spent 2 hours in the library. Not unusual. She read seriously for her age, and the library was one of the few spaces in the building where she seemed fully at ease. But one of the staff who tidied the room afterward mentioned again lightly, again without understanding the weight of it, that Charlotte had been going through the household calendar archives, the physical ones, the bound volumes that go back decades. She'd been cross-referencing. The meeting was attended by Camilla, two of Camilla's personal staff, and this is significant, one of the household communications coordinators whose specific function was managing the narrative around family events. That coordinator had no reason to be in an informal check-in with Charlotte. Charlotte, apparently, noted this. She sat down. She was polite. She was composed in the way that she had learned to be composed. That careful quality she'd developed over the past 2 years of navigating rooms that wanted to destabilize her. She listened. What was said to her, in essence, couched in warmth, framed as concern, delivered with the vocabulary of care, was that Charlotte was developing a reputation, that people had noticed she sometimes seemed confused about schedules, seemed to arrive at the wrong places, seemed to create complications for the household without meaning to. That this was, of course, and perfectly understandable for a young girl. That they only wanted to help her find her footing. That perhaps it would be better going forward if Charlotte's engagements were managed a bit more carefully. Filtered, you might say. Simplified, for her own benefit. This is the moment. This is where Charlotte, 13 years old, daughter of the Prince of Wales, girl who had spent 2 years watching herself be slowly and systematically removed, drew the line. She said, "I'd like to see the documentation for each scheduling conflict." The room went quiet. She said it again, politely, without raised voice. "I've been reviewing the calendar archives and I've noticed some inconsistencies. I'd like to understand them better. Could we go through them together?" She had the dates written down, in a small notebook she'd brought with her, and in her own handwriting. She put it on the table. What followed, I'm told, lasted approximately 45 minutes. I'm not going to pretend Charlotte dismantled everything in that room. She was 13. They were adults with decades of practice in the particular skill of plausible deniability. They had answers, not good answers, answers that didn't survive scrutiny, but answers. They maintained the framing. They expressed concern. They used the word worried 4 times. But here's what they hadn't planned for. Charlotte hadn't brought the notebook to argue. She'd brought it to document that she had asked. She understood, at 13, which is staggering, that the purpose of the meeting was not to help her. The purpose was to get her agreement to a set of arrangements that would further reduce her visibility and her agency. That and what she was doing with her small notebook on the table was declining to provide that agreement while creating a record that she had declined. She left the meeting having committed to nothing. She smiled at the door. She thanked them for their concern. She walked down the corridor, and I can only imagine what her face did when she was certain no one was watching. The communications coordinator submitted a report within the hour. I know this because the report passed through a channel I had legitimate access to, and I read it before I had reason to know I shouldn't. The report characterized the meeting as productive and noted that Charlotte had been receptive to feedback. Charlotte, who had put a notebook on a table and refused to disappear. Receptive. I made my 48th log entry that evening. This one had adjectives. End of part 2. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in April. Not because it was dramatic. Not because anything official happened. I want to tell you about it because it was the day I understood that Charlotte was going to be all right. And I want to be precise about what all right means, because it doesn't mean what the storybooks say it does. It was a wet April, the whole month dripping and gray, the kind of British spring that makes you feel the sun was a rumor someone started in good faith. I was on morning rotation, posted at the East Corridor Junction from 7 until 11. Quiet shift. The building had that still, damp quality it gets when the weather outside makes everyone move a little slower. Charlotte came through at 8:43. She was in school clothes, backpack, and the particular resigned expression of a teenager who has made peace with early mornings without actually approving of them. She was eating a piece of toast as she walked, which is technically not permitted in that corridor, and she knew it and did it anyway, with the precise level of transgression that signals I know the rule, and I'm choosing this minor breach, and I'm prepared for the consequence rather than ignorant disregard. She was becoming someone. She saw me and gave the small nod that she gave to the guards she recognized, not performative, not the practiced warmth of someone who had been coached to be gracious to staff. Just acknowledgement. I see you, you see me, we are both here at 8:43 in the wet April morning. Then she stopped. I don't know what made her stop. I don't know what I looked like that morning. I'd had a bad night. My mother was ill and I'd been on the phone until late, and perhaps something of that was legible on my face despite 12 years of practice keeping it blank. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You all right?" Just that. Casual, genuine, already moving again before I could answer, not requiring anything from me, just noticing. The way she'd learned to notice. Turning the skill outward for once instead of inward. I said I was fine. She said, "Good," already halfway down the corridor, toast in hand. I stood there for a moment in the empty corridor. There is a version of this story where I'm the hero, where I escalated through the right channels, or went to a journalist, or handed my green notebook to someone powerful and watched justice arrive in a formal procession. That's not what happened. What happened is smaller and, I think, more honest. I kept my log. I continued to note what I observed, with dates and times, in flat language with the adjectives in my head. I submitted 2 internal concerns through official channels, both of which were received politely and resolved into nothing. I spoke carefully to one senior colleague who I trusted and who confirmed, without saying so directly, in the way people confirm things without saying them directly, that I was not seeing things that weren't there. That was important, not a triumph, but important. And I watched Charlotte. What I observed after March changed in quality, not immediately. And the machinery that had been operating around her didn't stop because she'd put a notebook on a table. The schedule conflicts continued. The framing of her as unreliable, disorganized, a child who created complications, that continued. The photographs on the side table did not rearrange themselves back to where they'd been. But Charlotte had changed. The self-doubt I'd watched develop over 2 years. The double-checking, the apologizing for things that weren't her fault. The way she'd taken on the household's narrative about her own confusion, that began, slowly, to stop. Not in a dramatic reversal, more like a tide going out. The questions she asked out loud moved from, "Is this right?" to, "Can you show me that in writing?" Subtle. Devastating difference. She started talking to her father more. And I noticed this in the scheduling. William's time with Charlotte increased through the spring, quiet private time, no staff present. I don't know what was said in those rooms. I only know the shape of it from the outside. A father and his daughter, rebuilding or perhaps building for the first time a vocabulary for what had been happening. And I know that in June, 2 of Camilla's personal staff were quietly reassigned. The communications coordinator who had filed the receptive report no longer appeared in any briefings I was party to. These things happened without announcement, no statement, no acknowledgement. The machinery adjusted, and no one said why, and nothing was placed on the record. I'm placing it on the record now. I'm aware of what this costs. I'm aware that I cannot prove intent. That circumstantial documentation is not a criminal case, that what I am describing is the kind of harm that institutions are perfectly constructed to deny. I've thought about that for 3 years, and I've decided that the inability to prove something is not the same as the obligation to stay silent about it. Charlotte was 11 when it started. She was a child. She was a child who went into a room one afternoon with mud on her boots and joy on her face, and came out 4 minutes later walking carefully, making sure the door didn't make a sound. She didn't deserve that. No child deserves that. What I want to say at the end of this, the thing I kept coming back to on the 11:20 train, in the yellow light, writing in my green notebook, is this. Charlotte didn't win because someone saved her. She won because she refused. At 13 years old, with everything working against her sense of her own perception, to stop trusting what she saw. She kept her own record. She did her research. She walked into a room designed to diminish her and put her evidence on the table. She is not all right in the way that means nothing happened. She is all right in the way that means it happened, she knows it happened, and she kept herself anyway. That is a different and harder kind of all right. It is also the only kind that lasts. I no longer work in that corridor. I requested a transfer in the autumn, and it was granted without question. Whether because no one wanted me asking questions near that east wing, or simply because transfers are routine, I'll never know. I still have the green notebook, all 48 entries. I thought, for a long time, and that there would be a moment when it would matter in some official way. Handed over, read into a record, received by someone with the power to do something formal with it. I've let go of that. What I believe now is that the record matters because it exists. Because the truth of what happened to a child in those corridors does not require official acknowledgement to be true, because I saw it, and I wrote it down. And now, I've said it plainly. Charlotte stood her ground. I'm standing in the only place I can. That will have to be enough. End of Part 3. The author of this account has requested anonymity. Details have been generalized to protect identity. The events described took place over a period of approximately 2 years and are presented as personal observation and documented experience. No classified or protected information has been disclosed.